Wow, thank you. That's nice.
So I was just saying.
What did you say?
I was just saying to Jeffrey Sachs upstairs that we've been trying to get him for a while, and I'm delighted that he's finally been able to come during my tenure, which is quite a selfish thing to say, but it's fantastic to have you here.
Hey, thank you.
The first question I wanted to start with is the importance of a well-designed development aid for advanced economies, and how, given the US state, the political state in the US and quite a few other countries, the importance of and discussion of aid for countries has decreased since 2008. How do we make this issue topical and restructure development aid to be most effective again?
Thanks a lot. It's pretty strange. We have a kind of unusual president right now. I'm sure we'll have something more to discuss about him. But he came in and he proposed a big slash of aid, because that's the kind of crude populism that he represents. And even the Republicans, which are not, normally the great defenders of aid, completely rejected the proposal for deep cuts. And that already tells you something, that there's still a shred of decency in the United States. Not a lot in Washington, but there still is some, and there still is some awareness that that aid is part of the most basic level of holding the world together. There are people that are suffering. There are people that are extremely poor. If we don't help them, they die, or their societies become completely vulnerable to disease or to conflict or mass migration. So the world's not very generous about any of this. Even the ultimate standard, which the UK fulfills now, is less than 1% of income. So it's not heroism exactly to reach 0.7%. 0.7, 70% of 1% is taken to be the standard. And there are 5 or 6 countries that reach that and no others. And the 5 or 6 is that the Netherlands is sometimes up and sometimes down these days. But it's normally Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands that have been the 5 to reach the 0.7 of national income. Again, pretty modest standard of aid. And the UK, all parties adopted the 0.7, and to David Cameron's great credit, they got that through, and it remains the law of the land, and it remains the practice of the UK. So I believe that it's the most minimal standard for the world, and all the debate about aid I find pretty lame, actually. Because within a country, you don't say, should we give less than 1% to the poorest of the poor, even the nastiest places in the world, and I live in one of the nastier places, understands that you don't just leave people to die in general. It's a horrible thing. And so you spend some money for transfers. But then when it comes to the international scene, then my profession, the economics profession, spends 50 years debating 0.7, nah, 0.2 maybe, all, in my view, a completely misplaced thought, because what is good to debate, you asked me the right question, how should aid work? Not should we have it, but what would actually be a good practice for this? And I'll tell you, and just then stop my monologue, my favorite kind of aid over the last 15 years has been aid to control epidemic diseases, especially AIDS, TB, and malaria, from a fund called the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB, and Malaria. And the reason I like it is that it's very straightforward. The donors put their money into one pool, and countries submit national proposals, and those proposals are technically reviewed, And if they're technically sound, then the money is given, and then the program is audited. Was it followed through? And it has worked to bring those disease epidemics under control quite substantially. And so it has a lot of features that I like. One is that the country is the one in the lead. It says, here's what I need. Second, aid is viewed as a contract, which I think is the right way to view it. It's not charity, it's not do what you want with it, it's not steal it if you like. It's, look, we're going to give you something and you're going to use it well, and we're all going to be satisfied as a result of this, so it's professional. Third, as I mentioned, the plans are reviewed by an expert committee, not by politicians. It's not a political decision. It's just, will this policy that is being submitted for funding actually work to control AIDS or to control malaria or TB? And I like that standard because I don't believe in aid as political conditionality. We'll give you the money if you run your election the right way. I don't even really believe in it for human rights. You know, we'll give it if you obey human rights. I don't believe one country can really run the politics of another country. I think it's presumptuous, I think it's arrogant, but I do believe that resources can help poor people get out of poverty or to stay alive, which is, in my view, not dependency or arrogance, but just functional approach and respectful approach. And so I believe that the right conditions for aid should be, will this work to satisfy the reasons that the aid is being given, and that the reason should not be political reasons, because I don't think that works, but should be technical reasons in the sense of disease control and so on. And one last point. I've been in the room many times with heads of state of developing countries, and maybe the IMF comes in or the World Bank or somebody else comes in, and they make all sorts of demands. Maybe even I agree with the demands, but I don't agree. I mean, I agree with what they're advocating, but I don't agree with the demand per se. And then the door shuts and the leader looks at me and says, who do they think runs this country? Because it's inherently very arrogant, I think, to believe that you can run the politics of some other country, even if you're a rich, powerful outside country. And the truth is, you can't actually anyway. So bottom line, aid's really important. If it were 5% of our national income, it would be better. If it were 1%, it would be sane and civilized. The United States, I should have mentioned, we're not at 0.7, we're at 0.17. So we're at 1/4 the level. We're the nastiest, stingiest country because we have to save all that money for drone missiles to bomb these places instead, because they're all unstable. So the only solution to instability is bomb them. As it's kind of stupid.
Just touching on that last point, it's a lot of people try and look to the US as the role model and the country.
Don't do that anymore.
Well, so my exact question was: are you cynical, given November's election, that US is increasingly now going to be a bad role model? Are you cynical about the future prospects of the US to sort of play that role? And would you try and tell everyone here to actually, like you say, not use the US as a role model?
I'm not cynical. I'm accurate. The US is not a role model, God forbid, and it's actually, unfortunately, a dangerous country right now, very dangerous country. And I don't say that lightly, and I don't say it flippantly. Do not elect Donald Trump to anything. He is psychologically unstable. He's sociopathic, and he has no business being anywhere near power. So that's a bad thing. But even before Donald Trump, the US was, unfortunately, it had kind of lost the direction. And I was not a great fan of Barack Obama's foreign policy, except in some particulars like the Iran nuclear deal. But Barack Obama continued the war in Afghanistan. He signed up a secret war in Syria, because don't believe that's a civil war. That is a CIA-Saudi war to overthrow Saddam Hussein, which failed and created misery and mass refugees and a European crisis and many other things, but it was a war to overthrow a government. Not one that I like, but I don't believe in the CIA overthrowing governments, period. Barack Obama joined the war, not only joined, well, he, Cameron, and Sarkozy decided to overthrow Gaddafi in 2011. That was a dumb idea also, because whether you do it in a covert operation like the Saudis and the CIA tried in Syria, or you do it by NATO bombing, as happened in Libya, the result is bound to be terrible, because you'll open up a political vacuum, you'll create the conditions for civil war, for massive gun running, for a spread of violence to places like Mali, which happened. And so that was, again, Obama. We're in the war in Yemen because the Saudis begged us to be in the war in Yemen, because the Saudis pay a lot of things in the United States, so we do what they want, which is not a good idea for them or for us. And so the United States ceased to be a role model a long time ago. And it is not the indispensable country. It is not the world's sole superpower. None of that. It is a big, rich, militarily hyper-armed country that has a lot of bad foreign policy instincts and needs a good course in geography from the Oxford Geography Department. Because Americans don't know. I have a rule which I will quote myself, which is that you're not allowed to bomb a country if you can't name 2 cities in it. Because my view is that that would lead to world peace. But it certainly would stop all American bombing.
Given everything you just said about the United States, why is it that your main role at the moment is as special advisor to the UN Secretary General? Do you not ever think that actually you could best have an impact by focusing your attention on trying to advise and getting into the administration in America and using those skills to
Not this administration,
is the UN a little bit
that's
safe,
for sure.
Perhaps?
It's interesting, when I started my career, which was a long time ago, back in 1980, and when I was even studying as a graduate student, but really after my wife, who's here, and I went backpacking in India in the late 1970s and saw the development challenges, and I got really convinced that this was just the most interesting and important thing I could work on and wanted to work on was questions of poverty and development. I remember very distinctly saying to myself, well, first, back in 1980, I said to myself, I'm an American economist, and that's good. I'm really proud of that. I will go out and I'll help the world and I'll be an American economist and America's good. We made the Marshall Plan and so forth. And I believed that, by the way, then. And even though I had grown up during the Vietnam War period, and the Vietnam War was a really dumb, stupid, obnoxious, horrific war of choice by the US, so it got everything wrong, as we've done many times since then. But anyway, just to give you the mindset, I thought, okay, this is a pretty good country, and I'm proud to be an American, and I'm going to go help fight poverty. And I said to myself sometime, I don't remember exactly when, but I said, I don't really have to work on the US because we're rich. It's the problems of economics, though I was trained, I am a macroeconomist, whether we grew at 2% or 2.4% or 1.8%, even though when you look at that, that's trillions of dollars maybe, it didn't interest me that much, because what difference would it make? You're rich, you're comfortable, a little bit more, a little bit less didn't seem to me to be the captivating issue on a planet where people are dying because they're in poverty, for example. So I said to myself, I don't have to work on the United States, thank goodness, and I'm going to work abroad. And I did that for basically 30 years. And starting in the early 2000s, I started feeling not only is the United States not a role model, but it's really messed up. The domestic politics is mean. We got into a kind of jag that the highest calling of politics is tax cuts for rich people, which started with Ronald Reagan, and we've been doing that now for 36 years, and this is the great dream and obsession of the Republican Party that they're going to try to pull off again in the worst possible circumstances next month. So we've got a big brawl ahead politically in the United States. But things were really not going well. Not because the growth was only 2.3% versus 2.6%. That was the least of the problems. The most of the problem was America was nasty, it was unfair, our foreign policy was very violent. When we launched wars of shock and awe one day in March 2003 and just start bombing Iraq, that's madness. I don't know whether it was insanity or crypto-fascism or whatever it was, but it was incredibly awful. And then all through the period, I felt things were really, really off track. And then it became clear that America was actually in a health epidemic. We have, of course, the highest obesity rate in the whole world by far, and the mortality rate of white, non-minority, white, non-Hispanic, middle-aged people, the mortality rate started to rise. And the reason I mentioned that it's white, non-minority is that it's kind of going to the core of politics, you thought, in the US, but the death rates started to go up because suicide epidemics, drug abuse, opioid epidemics, and so forth. Well, I did reach the conclusion, starting about 7 or 8 years ago, that the US was sufficiently messed up, I should work on it. Not that I was going to solve the problems, but that it really, I couldn't in good faith with myself just ignore all of that. I like my country. You know, I want it to do well. I don't diss it for the sake of being cute or controversial. And my family's there, my children are there, my grandchildren are there. So I don't want it to go bad at all. So I wrote a book called The Price of Civilization in 2012, which was my first, quote, American book of trying to understand what's so messed up. And the idea of that title is a quotation from a great justice of the US Supreme Court, Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., who said, I like to pay taxes, that's the price of civilization. A concept basically unknown to most Americans over the last 40 years. And I've spent more and more time worrying about the US, of course. I don't want to give up the other issues that I find compelling and important, and I remain advisor to the Secretary General of the UN, and I really treasure that role and that opportunity. But I'm more and more launching political activities in the United States, including on Monday, a set of goals like the Sustainable Development Goals for America, where I'm really actively encouraging, and we'll unveil them on Monday, encouraging American politicians to get out of the rut of corruption, which is massive in the US because we have so much money. It's legal, but it's corruption nonetheless. $7-8 billion per federal election cycle right now. And that's money given by big, powerful interests and a lot of nasty people to a lot of politicians who sell themselves on the cheap on the whole. So you can really buy the whole Republican Party for just a few $100 million, which is what the Koch brothers have done. So the idea is to unveil some goals that could be ways to reorient the country towards important things. And one of my abiding beliefs for good economics and good public policy in general is set some clear objectives, set some goals on the horizon, not for today or next year, but for 10 or 20 years from now, for the work of the generation, and say, what could we achieve? Here's how we could form a path to actually build or rebuild a society, and then work on that. So my hope is it's actually going to be pretty active engagement politically, is that people of both major political parties, both the Democrats and Republicans, could sign on to a common set of goals as a kind of orientation for where we should go, and to get out of the craziness that the most important thing in the world is to end the estate tax, which is, of course, cut the Donald Trump family tax. And we've got to come back to the idea that we need clear shared aspirations above greed, which we don't have in the United States right now.
One of the buzzwords you used quite a few times was growth throughout that. And sustainable development combines economic, social, and environmental objectives, yet so often economic progress is only characterized by growth, and the attitude is taken that social and environmental objectives can be integrated once our economies are big enough with enough money available to begin redirecting it. With this mindset, we have become more unequal, unstable, and unfair, and the environmental risks are multiplying, I think, at a critical rate because of it. How do we equalize these three aspects of growth, and where do the changes need to be made to integrate economic, social, and environmental objectives into economic policy?
I knew at the end of his life and at the beginning of my career, the man who invented on the US side of the Atlantic the national income accounts, because they were more or less invented simultaneously in the US and the UK around 1920, and that was Simon Kuznets. And you probably know the name as the Kuznets curve about inequality. And he was a wonderful, incredible gentleman and a really fantastic scholar, of course, and a very kind man to a young student at the time. And one of the things he kept emphasizing was the GNP is not a measure of human welfare. It's a measure of market economic activity. Those are two different things. And it should not be used as a measure of human welfare. And he was very clear on the point, and it's good when you have the inventor of GNP in front of you. Listen to what he says. And this, I think, is basically true, that growth, period, has got to be the wrong thing to look at, period. And many of you will know the very famous speech that Robert F. Kennedy gave in 1968, where he said GDP measures just about everything except that which is important to us. And go home and Google it and look at wonderful words of a wonderful politician in the United States, a really gifted politician. So we do want economic progress, including material progress. And GNP is not the opposite of that by any means. So the truth is, as a development economist, if I want to know one number about a country, I would say, what is the GNP per capita if I wanted to know one number? Generally, I want to know hundreds of numbers, so I wouldn't stop with one number, but if I had to start with one number, I'd say one number, because then I would tell you with some level of accuracy probably what the life expectancy is, probably what the infant mortality rate is, probably what other conditions of deprivation or not are. But don't settle for one number. Now you can Google 1,000 numbers or 1,000,000 numbers. And so that's good. The idea that growth is like this idiot debate we're having in the United States. We got to raise the growth rate. We got to raise the growth rate. We're already at $60,000 per capita. We've had growth for decades, and we've screwed up so much of our society. If these dunderheads would stop taking cash from greedy billionaires who want their taxes cut and actually listen to their constituents, they wouldn't talk about the need to raise growth. We're already very rich. What we need to do is to raise the quality of life. So we need to help people who are suffering from epidemic diseases, or we need to help people who can't afford medicines, which is pervasive in the United States right now, because we have a pharmaceutical industry completely out of control. Why? Because they give money to congressmen to vote their stupid prerogatives rather than making sure that people can afford the medicines that they make. So I do believe in economic progress, and if you're coming from a poor country, you know there's a lot of progress that's needed. And GNP per capita is not the worst measure of that, as I said, if you need one measure. But what I believe in is measuring sustainable development rather than measuring GDP per capita. And sustainable development means economic development, which means material access to goods. But that also includes health, education, water, sanitation, as well as personal consumption spending. Second, it means fairness, justice, income inequality that is not so wide that people are unimaginably rich and simultaneously unimaginably poor. And that's true in the US, and it's true in many, many other places in the world. And third is no sense in destroying the environment to raise your growth, because we actually live as biological organisms within the environment. We take our happiness and our safety from the physical environment. And so the trade-off also doesn't make sense. Screw it up now and think you're going to recapture it later. By the way, you'll drive a lot of species to extinction in the interim, so you'll never recapture it. And when Sonia and I were in Hawaii for a couple of years ago for the IUCN meeting, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, I remember, it was shocking. Remember that book? Big, thick, beautiful book of birds. And it was a book, when you came close, it was a book of all the birds that have gone extinct in Hawaii. So it was a book of extinction. And it's just incredible how stupid we are. It doesn't come back. And so take some precautions. Think. And that is my basic message on good economics. 2 pieces of advice. Think and be nice. And then things will work out a lot better.
Great. I think actually that would be a good point to open up to the audience for questions. So if you have a question, raise your hand nice and high and wait for a microphone to get to you. If we start on the end, yeah, you in the corner. Yeah, you. Just wait for a microphone, I think. Yeah. Just wait for a microphone to come.
Thank you very much for coming and for sharing your thoughts. Great work you do with the United Nations, trying to get nations to cooperate towards sustainable development. But I wonder, because you talked about thinking long term, I wonder how you get to maintain relationships with countries as they transit from one government to another. Has that been difficult? What are the strategies you use to ensure that the objectives are still kept in place as governments transit from one administration to the other?
Yeah, that's a great idea, great point. Once I could hear it, and once I could hear the really good point you're making. How do we get anything long-term done with short-term politicians? That's a fundamental problem. A more fundamental problem is how do we get anything done with politicians? Now, first, the problem, and it's an ancient problem, the problem of politics is we need politics. And politics is, in its noble sense, what Aristotle said it is, which is the pursuit of the common interest. And in other words, it is actually not the dirty business as Machiavelli is interpreted, but it is in principle the noble business of pursuing the common interest. And Aristotle even had a good idea that living in the right kind of state and the right kind of polis, of city-state, one would cultivate virtues to be virtuous citizens to create a virtuous politics. And I think that is a right kind of vision. Of course, we don't have anything close to that right now. And we have institutions that vary. In some places they work pretty well. In the United States, they're rather dysfunctional right now. But we also have a problem that things that we want to do for the common good take time. And politicians are watching the clock. And especially in democracies, and there are good reasons to like democracies, they're watching the election cycle. And in the United States, they're watching the election cycle and the campaign contributions, because the corruption in the US comes from the fact that every 2 years we have the elections, and because the elections are financed by corporate interests and by rich people, the politician's hand is always out. And we have a Supreme Court, also deranged, actually, really got it wrong by saying that free speech meant the right of the inability to regulate corporate giving to politicians, because that would deny corporations free speech. So they pretended that companies were individuals. If you could put the companies in jail, I'd go along with that, because then we would also have some way to control these sometimes monsters. So we have a problem of politics. We have a problem of imperfect institutions. We have a problem that demagoguery also works because our own psyches are vulnerable to demagoguery, so it's not so hard to preach hate, and it's not so hard to lead populations to war. So that's our vulnerability to the worst kind of politics and the worst kind of politicians as well. So that's the proper study of political science, is to understand how do you make politics work. And probably the best book ever written about this was On Politics by Aristotle, and not too much got improved since 2,300 years ago, by the way, in the thinking of on this topic. But my answer to your specific question is that if we could adopt clear goals that transcend any administration, and that's why I like the Sustainable Development Goals agreed by all of the UN member states for the year 2030. As that point on the horizon, that's where we're supposed to go. And if we can build a public understanding that those goals are worthwhile, feasible, important, and transcend the election cycle, we have a base for actually accomplishing something longer term, and a way for accountability. It's not strong accountability, it's the kind of accountability that you have to work on all the time. It's quite imperfect. And in places where there is no civil society, it's not much of an answer, because governments crush populations, trying to keep them accountable. And that's not an answer, but overthrowing those governments by the CIA is also not an answer, I want to remind you. So there are not perfect answers in politics, but the best answer I know of is transcend politics by remembering that politics in its best form is about the common interest, and that can be explained by common goals, metrics, and social and political accountability. Of course, it's also true that one can think about institutional design. There are certain things that we don't let politicians meddle with all the time. That we have specialized agencies, expert agencies that maybe are reviewed by government but are not run by politicians. Believe me, every time I fly into an airport, I thank God that the air traffic control system is not run by politicians. It's run professionally. And you know why? Because the politicians also fly planes. That's the only reason. So they don't want politicians running it either. So that's what we need to do sometimes, is we need to put it on the same status as the air traffic control system. Let it be monitored democratically, but not run democratically. In a way, that's how we idealize the idea of central bank independence, for example. And there's some truth to how that has worked out institutionally. So shared goals in informed civil society, because without properly informed public, politics is impossible, period. Because even if the politician is sane at the start, they'll go insane by the end. Lord Acton was really right that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. That's not always true, but take it as a starting point. And so never leave the politicians alone. Don't let them own the government for their lifetimes. I happen to have come more and more to like monarchies, but constitutional monarchies. And the reason I say that is I don't like presidents who think they're kings, like the crazy guy we have right now. So we need to think about the institutions of politics, but basically we need to think about the purpose of politics. The purpose of politics is not Machiavellian holding on to power. That may be descriptive, but it's not normative. The purpose of politics, purpose in the Aristotelian sense of telos, the end purpose, is well-being. And we need to be clear that the purpose of politics is the well-being of the population. Define it, measure it, and hold the government accountable for it.
Let's go, you in the white top at the very end. Yeah, you.
You may have already answered this question, but you said that we need clear, shared aspirations above greed. Now, politicians go very hand in hand with greed at the moment. But do you think it's possible to escape greed? And if so, how?
I'm thinking. Most of our morality is very, very socially contextual and socially determined. And most of our views and what we think is right and decent and how we comport ourselves depends tremendously on the milieu in which we operate. And what that means is that societies are subject to multiple equilibria, we would say in economics. There are places that are rather ethical in behavior, and there are places that are almost bereft of ethics. And one of the main reasons is that in an ethical place, the ethics of others weighs on each individual to reinforce their own ethical feelings or guilt or sense of right and wrong or sense of purpose. And similarly, in a place that has, for whatever reason, lost the ethics, and there are lots of reasons for that: brutal governments, brutalized societies, societies that have destroyed civil society, that have terrorized populations, can lose the sinews of moral shared values over time. So I do think that it's possible to constrain greed. Greed is a possibility within all of us, but it's possible to cultivate some self-control, and it's possible to have norms of limiting greed. And the examples I always give in our world that I think are not wrong examples are the Scandinavian societies today, which are the fruits of course, of their long history, but also of their 100 years of social democracy, which I tremendously admire as a political ideology. And I think it's the most functional political ideology on the planet. In Sweden, greed is really kept under control. And I can give a very specific example of it based on the experience of a friend of mine who was the CEO of a major company, very respected businessman. And when he left, he took a mega severance payment of, I don't remember, $80 or $100 million. Not large by outrageous US standards, but greed by Swedish standards. He was shunned by Swedish society, actually. He had done nothing wrong. And he explained, well, that's how it's done. They said, that's not how it's done here. And he really was shamed for many, many years afterwards by this experience. And he gave back the money also. And so that's a society exercising decency, actually. Unimaginable in the United States. Once a year I go to a dinner. I drag my wife to it because she does not, I shouldn't say that because we'll never get the invitation again. But, okay. We go for sociological interest. Okay? Don't tell anybody. But it's a lot of the richest people in New York. And it's not our normal social circle, though it is part of my research agenda. And they always put me next to a crook. A man named John Paulson, who's one of the lead hedge fund. And if you're studying engineering at Harvard, you study at the Paulson School of Engineering now. Okay. He's a crook. The reason he's a crook is that in 2007 and 8, he conspired with a firm named Goldman something, conspired with Goldman to sell toxic assets to unknowing German investors, and especially the IKB Bank of Germany. Okay? And the idea was that he put together this toxic portfolio of mortgage-backed securities that he knew the mortgages were going to fail. He shorted it, in essence, through a little bit more complicated transaction. And he scored $1 billion in the transaction as IKB Bank lost $1 billion on the other side of the deal. Wow! To my mind, financial fraud. Well, the SEC opened an investigation, and they thought it was financial fraud too, but they didn't investigate Paulson, but they investigated Goldman something. And Goldman ended up paying a fine of, I think it was about $700 million. This is the Abacus case. And they never admitted wrong, but they made a settlement, a consent decree. and paid the fine. They never went after the guy that did it. He kept the $1 billion. Not only did he keep the $1 billion, he was considered a genius in New York. He was considered, the top of the industry. That is when the norms completely fail. They can't tell right from wrong on Wall Street right now. There have been so much abuse, so much cheating, and it's not just my saying so. There's actually, I don't have time to elaborate, but there's a whole literature, professional literature, of studying the social mores of Wall Street. It's a crooked place. But the social norms are to champion money-making, not to champion right, and not to diss wrong. And so greed is completely out of control. And that's a very serious problem. And so this is the sense, we all are susceptible to all sorts of bad behavior, especially if it's encouraged. We know from the Sembrano study and from many other studies that we'll do terrible things if it seems that it's socially sanctioned behavior. And so in this sense, greed's definitely part of our psyche if it is let loose. And to come back to my favorite philosopher, Aristotle, he emphasized you develop good behavior, good morals, what he called virtues, arete in Greek. You develop virtuous behavior by practice and by emulation and by education. And so, yes, greed can be resisted. It can't be eliminated, but it can be resisted, but it needs to be resisted at a social level, not just at an individual level.
Great. Let's go. Yeah, okay.
Thank you. I'm Nazik. I'm from Kyrgyzstan. Kyrgyzstan.
Yeah. Bishkek?
Bishkek, yes. I'm very happy to be here with you. And my question is about the question which is very important to our country. It's about the alignment of the international aid to with the priorities of the country. Because as you know, Kyrgyzstan is very dependent from donors' aid. However, there is a kind of a misalignment, and sometimes it gives an impression that international agencies help to build the second floor of the house, while government is failing to build the ground floor. So how should we address this issue?
Good. Thanks very much. So if there is going to be help for a country like Kyrgyzstan, how to make it useful and work right. And now I can combine the answer that I gave about aid to the answer that I gave about politics to the answer that I gave about having goals. My job at the UN is to advise the Secretary General and Deputy Secretary General on the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So they have the virtue of having been universally adopted by all 193 UN member states. They also have the virtue of being good. They really do express in a pretty succinct way what it means to have a society that is prosperous, fair, and environmentally sustainable. So achieving these goals would be a good thing, worth fighting for. So my view is, let's orient our understanding, our work effort, our development aid to achieve those goals that we have set ourselves. And the goals are for the year 2030. So that is basically little more than a dozen years from now. That's enough time to get a lot of good things done. When you look at these goals, for example, SDG 3 says universal health coverage. So everybody should have access to basic functional health care. SDG 4, which I really think is important, is universal education, at least through the secondary school level, for every child in the world. Pretty basic. SDG 7 and 13 are about moving to a low carbon economy. something we have to do if we're going to avoid climate disaster. So my view is set goals, study how to achieve them. I think it's a major task for all of us at universities. They're not simple. How can they be achieved? What kind of investments, what kind of technologies, what kind of public policies, what kind of strategies to achieve them? What kind of metrics and evaluation? This is good core work of public policy and engineering and science, which needs to help us understand what the right parameters are. And then development aid, which I very much believe in, should be oriented towards systematically supporting the achievement of these goals. If Kyrgyzstan achieves the Sustainable Development Goals, it will build the foundation as well as the second floor. And if the international agencies take that on, they will help Kyrgyzstan to do it. It's not easy to do this. It's what we call coherence of the international system. Getting different agencies, different politicians, different governments, different specialized organizations to all focus on a particular set of challenges. And of course, if I just listed the goals, they'd say, well, who the hell are you to tell us what to focus on? But the advantage that the UN has done it is that it's universal. All governments raised their hand and said yes that morning, September 25th, 2015. They really did. And so that gives a legitimacy that is good. And my recommendation to you is that the goals are good also. I wouldn't necessarily have stated every one in exactly the same way, but they came up with a good set of goals that if we achieve them, the world's going to be a lot better. And so we don't have to keep reinventing our own thing. We should now try to do what collectively we promised to do.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm afraid that is all we have time for. I'm sure you're all...
Will you invite me back sometime?
Well, yeah, now you've accepted once, we can hopefully get through it. I'm sure you're all as inspired as I am by that. Will join me in thanking Jeffrey Sachs warmly for coming.